very happy to introduce our keynote speaker, Lawrence Bowdish, Director of Research and Issue Networks in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Lawrence started consulting with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Corporate Citizenship Center on its issue network research in May 2013. He conducts long-term research projects concentrating on issues related to corporate social responsibility. He leverages qualitative and quantitative tools that drive meaningful impact through his research. He holds a PhD in Modern American and Economic History from Ohio State University and a BA in History and Economics from New College of Florida. Lawrence brings a wealth of knowledge about the economic advantages of building diverse communities. Welcome, Lawrence. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks again to United Way, Franklin County, for bringing me here. I love making these types of presentations. The realities of COVID in the past year have meant I've been working a lot in just sort of programmatic responses. So I really love sort of diving deep into how to really address and answer some of these issues that we're talking about with diversity and inclusion. Amy did mention my PhD is from Ohio State. I know we're probably more than one Nittany Lion on the attendee list today, so apologies. You have to listen to a Buckeye talk for a little bit, but I promise I'll make it worth your while. So I'm gonna share my screen here. So I want to start, first of all, by, and I do have the question and answer box open in case someone has something they'd like to ask. So I would like to start with sort of an elephant in the room. I am a white, male, elder millennial, younger Gen X, cisgendered, strikingly attractive male, and I'm the one here talking about diversity. And that's an issue. Right, and it's an issue because when we talk about diversity and inclusion for communities, you generally want to hear from those communities. But what I want to put out here is the fact that I have my training is in figuring out how to tell appropriate stories. And there's a way to do that and tell that story without disintermediating the people you're telling the story about. So when I tell this story, I'm telling it, Michigan, I'm telling it about the stories about the systems in which diversity and inclusion exist. There are plenty of other people who can tell much more compelling, much more important stories about the people for whom it impacts, but I'm here to set stages. And so I want to start with a little bit of background. I want to start with Robert Putnam. Robert Putnam, based on, if you took a political science or sociology class in college, if you're my age or older, you probably read the book on the left, Bowling Alone. If you were younger, you probably read The Upswing, which came out a few years ago. And Robert Putnam made a name for himself by talking about the importance of civic engagement, talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and that communities strengthened or weakened based on their level of diversity. And so what he found in Bowling Alone was that in the 70s, in the post sort of 68 era of the United States, there was a decline in civic engagement. And he cited that civic engagement based on the fact that a lot of these fraternal organizations were declining. So the ways in which people built social connections before 1968, church, frat orders, women's auxiliaries, they became weaker, fractured, fewer of them. They started to die off in the post-Vietnam War era, along with the fact that a lot of workplaces were becoming more diverse. And that's an important thing to consider. When workplaces became more diverse by steps in the late 60s and 70s, just it created a tension that I'll get to in a few minutes, but I want to put a mark there for that. The upswing is, after people talking about Bowling Alone for 20 years, the upswing is Robert Putnam's goal to how coming together, being diverse, being inclusive as a society can strengthen it. But in between these two, he wrote an article that didn't get a lot of attention or a lot of press. And this article was E Pluribus Unum, Diversity Community in the 21st Century. So he had conducted a massive survey in 2000, a few years after the new edition of Bowling Alone came out. trying to figure out just exactly what the impact of inclusion and diversity was in communities. And what he found, he did this by surveying about 30,000 adults across 15 large cities in the United States. What he found was that the greater the diversity in community, he actually found the opposite of what Bowling Alone suggested, that fewer people voted, they volunteered less, they gave to charity less, they worked on community projects less, based on more diversity was, and controlling for everything. And in fact, he actually, the academic community actually sort of attacked him for it, because he conducted the survey in 2000 and this didn't come out until 2006. And he admitted that he spent 6 years trying to fix this result, trying to come up with the idea that, or trying to fix the idea that more diverse communities actually end up with less civic engagement. And his finding near the bottom was that the real issue in that diverse communities, neighbors trust each other about half as much as they do in communities that aren't diverse. And he spent a long time trying to fix that, and he never really did. He's been trying to, it looks like Upswinger sort of mea culpas for this, and he's trying to convince the academic community that there is actually, that he was wrong, or there's something wrong with his work. Well, fortunately enough for him, the issue with this is that there are studies that actually support him. But the issue isn't that diverse communities aren't more powerful, they aren't stronger, they aren't more resilient, is that there is an issue with how they are diverse, right? So there's a difference between a community being diverse, you're checking boxes for demographics, and one being inclusive. And so there was a study done. A lot of Europeans do studies about American racial politics. So there's a study done, and I can forward all these after the fact. So that found that whites who reside in areas with larger racial minority populations, so this is called fractionalization. I'll get to that in my breakout. To express a greater perceived threat, they perceive greater threat, more bias, and less support for racial integration than whites that live in smaller minority populations. But that same study found that, particularly for, this is stronger for Latinos, that Latinos that lived in surrounding census blocks made the inclusive attitudes of whites worse. But within the block, if whites lived in the block with Latinos, it actually made the impacts of diversity and inclusion higher. Whites were less likely to report these types of issues. And I want to stop for a second and talk a little bit about what the population looks like in the US and in Chambersburg. Now, you're going to hear me talk about Chambersburg throughout the rest of this presentation. I almost always am talking about the Chambersburg Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is more or less Franklin County. There are some outlying areas that it kind of cookies in and whatnot. Chambersburg, the Chambersburg MSA is part of the Washington, D.C., Baltimore combined statistical area, so I'm not using that. I'm using just the MSA, which is largely Franklin County. There are a few places where I use Franklin County alone, and that's clear. So I just wanted to put that out there, make sure everyone sort of understood. So this is what the population looks like. And as you can see, Chambersburg is, by color definition, less diverse in the United States as a whole. I put an asterisk there in front of Hispanic because Hispanic is an ethnicity, and so the MSA numbers don't pull out everyone who marks Hispanic who isn't white. So it's possible there's some double counting between Hispanic and anything not white in the Chambersburg example. And so when you look at this, you might think about what it is in this community that's diverse or not, and whether or not there's something about what Putnam believes or believed 15 years ago about the impacts of diversity on community. Well, fortunately enough, Putnam was wrong, because every study since then has shown that the smaller the geographic area, the more likely that ethnic diversity predicts lower levels and greater outcomes. So Putnam's issue was the fact that he was looking at large MSAs and not sort of drilling down. And if you look at, there's a big debate. If you were to type in, is diversity good for a country, right? And type that in, you're going to see a pretty robust debate about whether or not that's the case. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that diverse countries are actually less economically successful, controlled for other issues. There are some that suggest that it doesn't matter. There's a few that suggest it helps. But what happens is as you drive down that level deeper and deeper, you find that diversity ends up becoming more and more effective, right? It becomes more and more effective because of something called contact theory. So contact theory states that the ideal circumstances for contact, so the fact that everyone has equal status, everyone has common goals, everyone cooperates, everyone has support of the authorities, reduces intergroup anxiety, feelings of threat and hostility towards outgroups. And what I've put here on the right is this is the Mandelbrot graph, and this is looking at nonlinearity, and it's recursive. And so parts of the Mandelbrot graph are recursive. And so as you zoom into any particular part of it, it looks the same as far down as you go. Well, that's not true for diverse countries. It's not true. As you drive down, they aren't recursive. They aren't recursive, and we just showed that with the demographics of the United States. You're not going to find a mini US as you go to any state. You're not going to find a mini state as you go down to every city. You're not going to find a mini city as you go down to the neighborhood. And the impact of diversity gets stronger the deeper down you go. So I spend most of my time, since my academic days at least, talking about the business community. And so from here on, I'm going to talk a little bit about how businesses really are kind of one of the smallest communities that where this works, and why, if you think about business as a community, why making that diverse and inclusive, along with making the community in which it exists diverse and inclusive, is important. But I do want to start with a second by talking about what I'm not going to talk about in this keynote. I may talk about a little bit in the breakout. Is that this isn't about economic outcomes, right? I'm not going to make the debate that a community, business, state, whatever, that is more diverse is going to have better economic outcomes, because what I don't want to do is I don't want to make this about, I don't want to gamify this, right? I don't want to give the idea that someone should pursue, that a community or someone or a business should pursue inclusion and diversity because of the economic case. Now, the economic case does exist, right? It's when you look at, particularly for businesses and communities, I mean, the more diverse they are, the more powerful they are, and that's something I'll dig into a little bit more in the breakout I'll have about this. But I don't want to talk about that here because, frankly, I started giving this presentation, versions of it. I've obviously edited and make it better, I hope, over time. But when I gave this, I started giving this out in 2016, 2017. And that was when, economics are great. Everyone's riding high. And I would always say, you don't want to hang your hat on making inclusion and diversity important by the economic outcomes, because when the economic outcomes reverse, you don't want that to be the reason you were doing it in the first place. And something that we'll continue to talk about here in a bit, economic outcomes reversed for many people 13 months ago. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. But just to put it out there is that companies that are gender diverse outperform their peers by a ratio about 1 out of 5. Ethnically diverse companies are about 1 out of 3. And this is controlling for everything else. The other aspect of what this isn't about is this is some research done by the Workplace Equality Index by Denver Investments, and they have a index that talks about how equal and inclusive workplaces are. So this is something that a company applies it into. Denver Investments audits them, vets them, makes sure everything's correct, and we'll put them in their index. So these are all publicly traded companies. So it means we're talking about the largest 850 whatever companies out of the 7 million in the United States. But what they show here, and this is something that I want everyone to sort of think about, because we'll talk about it a little more if you go to my keynote, or I can answer, or my breakout, obviously after you answer questions about it here if it comes up, is that it's about the journey, right? one of the reasons Putnam talked about the 70s as a problem is that it was sort of a moment in time and didn't think about the journey of diversity that was important. And you can see that very clearly in the in this workplace equality index. And what this graph shows, I'm sorry, I probably should explain it before I start talking about it, is that the x-axis is the years from when a company was put into the equality index. And so year 0, which would be in the middle of this graph, is the year that a company made it onto the index. And this is the stock price in the stock performance based to a basket of those companies' peers. And the dotted line is where it behaves the same. It has the same outcomes. And so very clearly, the journey that these companies make to become more inclusive, and you could say the same for communities, the journey that it makes is the one that brings it its value. If you take a photo or a snapshot of a company or a community in time, you're not going to be able to tell that diversity has done anything. You're going to have to look at what this one community has done over time. And so what you see here is that, 10 years before they were put on, companies not in the index, but that are going to be, underperform their peers. But then about the time they get in the index, and then once they're in it, they outperform their peers. And so, frankly, there's a debate to be had about, well, are successful and growing companies inclusive and diverse? Or are inclusive and diverse companies more successful? My point about that is, like, it doesn't really matter, right? The correlation or the causation doesn't matter because the outcome's the same. I'm sort of a Kantian in that sense, that the outcome is what matters, right? And whether or not your good companies do it because they're good, or it's what makes good companies good, doesn't matter because it's always a factor. So I do want to talk a little bit now about the one place where community and workplaces intersect, and that's in the workforce. So we're going to talk a little bit about workforce here. Now, I'm going to say a few different, I'm using a couple different definitions and words. I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what workforce means. And so this is the definition of workforce. You have civilian, non-institutional population, 16 and older. So this is everyone over the age of 16 who's not in the military, not in jail, or not committed to an institution. So most of them, they either work or they don't work. And if they work, they're employed. If they don't work, and they don't work because at the time of the survey they're sick, then they're employed. Or if they're on layoff or they're looking for work, they're unemployed. If they are not on layoff or looking for work, they are not in the labor force. And this is something to keep in mind, because I want to make sure, and I'm going to pound on this point for an important reason here in a bit, is that the unemployed is a very small section of the labor force. Because if you are unemployed, you either are on a layoff and you're going to be recalled, or you have looked for work in the last 4 weeks and available. And this is based on state definitions, and that average is 90 days. So most people cannot be unemployed for more than 90 days, and then they get removed from the labor force. But this is all the definitions and words that I'll be using in the next few slides. So first, let's look at the US's labor force participation rate. And so this is that green box, the green box, the labor force, divided by the civilian non-institutionalized population over 16, all ages, so 16 to 105, everybody. The U.S. has seen since the recovery, or since the recession of 2008, the U.S. has seen a just marked decrease in labor force participation rate. And this is one of the biggest economic questions we have as policy, is why are fewer people on ratio working in the U.S.? So about a third of this decline, from roughly 66 to 63, has to do with more people retiring. So a greater percentage of people are retiring, and they're retired longer. They're retiring earlier. That's only about a third of this decrease. The rest of it is almost economically unexplainable. There are some theories, but I don't like any of them, about why this is going down. And then what you might not be surprised by, and you might be seeing shadows. I moved the question box, apologies. What you might be surprised by, or not surprised by, is this is March of last year. Labor force participation rate plummeted, and it bounced up to about half, and now it's gone flat again. And it's flat regardless of all of the changes, all the improvements on unemployment we've seen. So I want to make sure, the reason I went over that definition before is to make sure that we're sort of on the same page here. Now, the BLS doesn't really report labor force participation rate for MSA, but it does give labor force. And so what I've done here is I've looked at the same amount of time, so 01 to 2001, by month for the Chambersburg MSA labor force, and looking at what the Chambersburg labor community looks like. So it's grown about 11% over time, but it's down from a 2008 peak, which flirted with 80,000 people. And this line looks relatively flat, but the population in Chambersburg has increased by 19%. And so there is a 2-for-1 ratio in where the Chambersburg, if there was a labor force participation rate chart for Chambersburg, it would look pretty similar to the chart we saw on the last page. And I spot checked a few, and the Chambersburg labor force participation rate tended down, was about half a percentage point lower than the US on point checks. So I feel pretty confident they will look pretty much exactly the same. And this is important because to be in one of the drivers of economic growth in community is the labor force, right? You can't convince companies to come to a community. You can't convince companies to invest in a community if you can't promise them a educated, well-trained, sizable workforce. And there's obviously a chicken and egg problem, right? Companies want to come to a place where there's people want to come to a place where there's companies. And the reason why this is important for diversity is the demographics I showed about Chambersburg before. And this is true for any location, right? If you depend on natural growth in the community, the demographics of the community will not change. You won't become more diverse by that. You generally almost always have to bring people in from somewhere else. And so I decided last night, just as I was thinking about how this would lay out, what that give and take looks like for Chambersburg. And so I looked at the last 5 years of in and out migration for Chambersburg, trying to figure out, is Chambersburg, if you look at other places that Chambersburg is going or coming from, or et cetera, I'm sorry, you might see a shadow. I'll move the question and answer box. What I found is that Chambersburg is mostly interacting, at least without migration, with very similar areas, right? And so what you see here is that this is the 5-year ACS. So this isn't necessarily a year-on-year thing. And what this question asks, what's your address? Okay, your address is in Chambersburg. Did you have the same address 1 year ago? And if that answer is no, they ask, where was that address? And that address was either somewhere else in the MSA, which is true. I think about 10,000 people moved within the Chambersburg MSA. But did it come from another MSA in the United States? Did it come from outside the United States? And what we see here is that, well, first of all, there's a general out-migration from Chambersburg, relatively small. It's pretty even between the two. But the people that are coming into Chambersburg are coming from Harrisburg, Hagerstown, and then the Washington, D.C. metro area and the Philadelphia metro area. You don't know anything. I don't know anything about the 490 people that moved to Chambersburg from D.C. or the 378 that moved there from Philadelphia. But knowing what I know about gerontology, I would theorize that there's probably likely retirees that are moving from those areas. People that are leaving Chambersburg are leaving for similar MSAs. So Harrisburg, Hagerstown, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Cedar Rapids, I tried to figure out why there was a massive outmigration to Cedar Rapids. Maybe a company moved from, in the past 5 years, from Chambersburg to Cedar Rapids. but that was sort of a striking difference in where people moved to from Chambersburg. And to become more diverse, the communities have to figure out sort of how to attract diverse populations. So generally, you can't get labor force participation rate by race on the MSAs. But generally, again, I'm from the Chamber of Commerce. I don't know if I even said that yet, but I'm from the Chamber of Commerce Foundation. The labor community, when you look at it, it should be a pretty good example of what diversity looks like. And nationally, there isn't much difference between one's race and whether or not they're in the labor force. The only Hispanic, Latino, Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander tend to go higher. But labor force participation is higher in groups that are less economically, that have performed less well economically because they have to work longer. So all this is to be expected. So I also thought about, well, what does the community of workers look like in Chambersburg? And so again, the BLS looks at the type of work that they do. Excuse me, this is American Community Survey. Looks at the type of work that someone does. And I've just highlighted here the places where the Chambersburg MSA is drastically different than the United States. So many fewer people in management professional roles, a lot more people in product transport roles. And this is important because when you're trying to become more diverse, inclusive, or attract diverse and inclusive communities, you actually end up the jobs that match the Chambersburg MSA actually match pretty closely, actually shockingly closely, where Black African American people work by industry. And so it's not that the business community in Chambersburg is not ripe, I guess, for diversity. It's just the match hasn't happened there. So how does a community attract people to coming in? Well, why do people move at all? Most people move for work. And so when you look at how you can get people to move for a job, you have to think about the type of jobs that are in place and whether those jobs are hired. So there's another thing I want to lay out here. So this is something that I would love, if you take away one thing about this, is not inclusionary related. It's the next couple of slides is what I want them to be. And I'm sorry, I'll make these slides available after the fact. This is the ratio of job openings to the unemployed in the United States by month. And so again, if you look at that chart I showed before, and I'll show it again in a minute, the chart I showed before that has the civilian and institutional population and the unemployed, and then the unemployed, but they're in the labor force. And you track them to how many job openings there are. And so this is, oh, I'm sorry, I just realized this is unemployed to job openings, apologies. The tan area in the middle is the 08 to 11 recession. And so you can see there are up to 6 unemployed persons for every job opening. For about a year and a half before COVID, there were more job openings than people, than unemployed people. If you gave every unemployed person in the United States a posted job placement, we couldn't fill all the job placements we had. Now, if I were on the C6 side of the chamber house, I'm the foundation, so I'm in the C3. If I were in the C6 side, I would spend the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about why there are sort of skills imbalances, other issues to sort of make that the case. I don't really care why that's the case, but it is important to sort of understand that, like, there's a lot of jobs out there that can be filled and aren't filled, and the unemployed aren't filling them. Right. Now, obviously, I do want to point out what happened in March, right? A lot of people lost their jobs, but it bounced back. Now, keep in mind, it bounced back quickly because of how unemployment's defined. You aren't unemployed indefinitely. All right, and I'm close to explaining why that's a problem here in a bit. I also marked here that this was last month. Last month, the Chambersburg MSA had 5.9% unemployment. This ranks at 225 out of 389 MSAs. The national average is 6 and change. So this is the same chart for Maryland, Pennsylvania. For this chart, we only do this chart for the 15 largest MSAs. So I did Pennsylvania and Maryland. They're very similar. They track pretty close to the same. So, but just wanted to show that even though, you know, it's not the US, it does look, the Chambersburg area looks pretty similar. And there's one more chart I want to show you because, or excuse me, the next chart I want to show you is just the number of voluntary quits by month. Now, this is the important, diverse, and inclusive aspect of this, because when you think about why people sort of leave work, you know, obviously people leave it for, you know, they leave it for better jobs. They leave it because, you know, family moves and they gotta get a new job, or they don't like where they're working. And a lot of inclusive and diverse people, a lot of people that don't work in inclusive and diverse job places want to, and they leave because of it. And what I want to sort of show here is that up until COVID, so when we're talking January, February, March of 2020, we had historically highest ever rates of people leaving the workforce, of people just quitting their jobs. This does not count people getting laid off or fired, doesn't count retirements. This counts people just quitting their job, walking off, not fired, walking off. To the point where when we were getting to January and February, 1 out of every 40 people in the private sector workforce was quitting every month. Now, obviously that plummeted during the COVID recession for a month or two, but it's back to almost those historic levels now. Right. So to the other side of that diverse and inclusive aspect where I argue don't make it about the economics, right? Well, the economy hasn't recovered yet. And people are still quitting their jobs at a rate similar to what they were quitting them at before this even happened. So labor is voting with their feet, right? And there are a couple of ways that businesses can deal with that, but we have to think about both in the labor community and in the physical community, in the place. If people are going to vote with their feet, the more people you lose, the harder it's going to be inclusive and diverse. And the harder it's going to be, if you aren't inclusive and diverse, the harder it's going to be to keep them. There are similar levels of quits. This is for Pennsylvania and Maryland again. They only do them in state by quarter, but you can sort of see the same sort of impact here: plummets and then recoveries. And then just want to make sure we see that. I want to share this again because I'm going to talk about another aspect of it that really gets to the heart of inclusion and diversity. So keep in mind, civilian non-institutional population, labor force. So there's a group of people, in fact, I'll even point it out, there's a group of people not in the labor force. So this orange box at the bottom, which makes up 38% of the population, not in the labor force. Well, where are they? Right? If they're not unemployed, they're not working, where are they? And so this is something that doesn't get tracked on state MSA, it's only tracked on the national level. And it's by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Those people that aren't in the labor force are broken up into a couple of categories. But generally, you can think of them as discouraged or they don't want a job. People that don't want a job are defined as if you came and gave them an offer for a job that paid them the same that they made in the last job they made, would they take it? So this is your stay-at-home mothers and housewives, your retirees, independently wealthy, assumably, are people that are in the don't want category. Discouraged has a couple of sub buckets, but they're unimportant for this conversation. Discouraged are people that looked for jobs while they're unemployed, came off the unemployment rolls and are still looking for jobs. I want to be clear that just because someone comes off an unemployment roll because they stopped getting a check doesn't mean there may no longer be unemployed statistically, but they aren't unemployed in their lives. And so what I want to point out here is that just the discourage rate of workers is generally higher than the unemployment rate. And these numbers were before these numbers were from when the unemployment was 2 to 3%. There's almost half again more people who want a job and can't get it. And those numbers are much higher for African Americans. They're higher for Hispanic community. And this is where these numbers, these discouraged numbers, these are the people who are more likely going to fill those, when the job openings, there are more job openings than employed. They have to come from here. And figuring out how to reach these, particularly these individuals here, particularly the young African-American community here, 12% of 16 to 24-year-old African-Americans are discouraged from work. Fixing that is going to be an important aspect dealing with inclusion and diversity, both for individual businesses and the communities in which they live. And this isn't a problem of large companies, right? I mean, I think a lot of people sort of guess that since I'm with the Chamber of Commerce, I'm primarily the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I'm primarily talking to the, 20,000 plus employee companies, and that's not the case because most people don't work for 20,000 plus employee company. There are close to 8 million companies in the U.S. or employer firms in the U.S. There are 3,000 in Franklin County. Almost all of them have fewer than 500 employees. In fact, so many fewer of them there are so few that have more than 500, it's almost a rounding error. And that's almost as true for 50 employees even, right? If you really want to encourage inclusion and diversity, either as a business or in the business community, you've got to make sure that the small companies are ready to execute. And if you're in a community that wants to improve and gain the benefits from and work on inclusion and diversity, you've got to make sure you focus on the small companies, because the small companies make up almost the entirety of your business community and they employ most of your individuals. And so I want to make sure that whatever we're talking about isn't high-end, isn't sort of some high-end consultant speak for large companies to sort of make these sort of changes in their strategies and tactics. We need actionable things for small companies. And so there are two realities I want to talk about. And this is, I talk about companies here, but you can also think about communities at the same time. And that is, no companies ever failed because they weren't inclusive, right? Companies don't shut down because they weren't inclusive. And at the same time, particularly for small businesses, inclusion is never the fire they have to put on any given day. And this is true for communities. I mean, for the past, the tragedies of last summer aside in Louisville and Minneapolis, and now more currently in Columbus, it would have been really difficult in the past year and a half to go to a virtual city council meeting and talk about why inclusion is important. When just the realities of the moment are the fire that need to be put out. And so we have to figure out how to make diversity and inclusion kind of built into communities and businesses. And so when you think about why it's important for small businesses can't compete for labor with large businesses. They just can't, because their wages, and this is on its face, their wages are so much less. And so this is from 2019, this is private employment. So this doesn't count government employment, company payrolls. And so on average, private institutions pay $55,800 in salary per person in payroll. That is smaller establishments pay about that. And this is filled with one-person consultancy shops. They're going to pay themselves pretty well. But when you look at the true small businesses, the true small employers, like they are paying, they are paying almost 20% less than the national average. And so how do you get these what is going to encourage small businesses, or what's going to encourage labor to come to small businesses? And for almost every community in the United States, I'm not just saying this because it's this Chambersburg, I would say this is essentially all but 5 cities in the United States. If you're going to attract a diverse and inclusive population, if you're going to keep them, if you're going to grow your communities, you're going to have to do it with companies that are in this sort of 50 employees and down bucket, right? You can't, it's difficult to do it by moving one of the 5,000 companies in the United States to more than 1,000 employees. And so to do that, you have to, not only do you need a diverse and inclusive community, but those businesses and those institutions that come in need to be diverse and inclusive to keep their employees. Now, there's obviously a lot that has been said about millennials, right? And what they want in a workforce and what they demand, that they vote with their feet. And that's tough to know, but very soon, millennials are going to make up, they already make up a plurality of the workforce. They're going to be a majority quite soon. And so knowing what employees want is going to be really important, and being able to keep them is going to be really important. And if you can't compete with wages because you are a community that just has lower than average wages, like Franklin County, or you're a small business that has to pay lower than average wages because you're a small business, these diverse and inclusive strategies and tactics are going to be paramount to making your employees and your population feel welcome in the community that they're in. So I've talked a little bit about these issues of diversity and inclusion that frankly are easy to count, right? You talk about race and gender and age and educational attainment. Some aspects of disability are easy to count, not all, of course. But does this work as well for things that are harder to track? And so, we've done a lot of work in the LGBT space, and I wanted to sort of point this out here for just a moment, just to show that it's not just about sort of the checking boxes because you look like your community or your company or your state look diverse. There's a lot of LGBT individuals in the U.S. Almost half of them are closeted at work, and this is regardless of the nature of the work they do. And about 2 out of 5 LGBT individuals have left a job because of bullying. And this is just a snapshot of why diversity and inclusion is important to keeping people in your community. This is sort of work we've done that shows inclusive practices and policies. I'm going to run through these. It's important that these remain authentic, right? That you can't, companies and communities that try to gamify this get seen through really quickly. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my breakout. These are, I should have taken these out, excuse me. And you need to make sure that individuals are buying into the diversity and inclusion. This is true for businesses and communities. And so this comes in a couple of ways. One is that the people at the top buy in, and for communities, this is political leadership. It is community leadership. It is folks that people listen to. Like who are the people in your community that people will listen to, and make sure that they are the ones that are really helping drive the importance of diversity and inclusion. You need the people, just the rank and file of other companies or communities to also participate. And then make sure that whatever happens is a microcosm. So in all these different areas happens generally, right? It's not going to help if Chambersburg, if Chambersburg has a pride parade, but at the same time passes bathroom laws, it passes bathroom bills, right? Making sure that what happens within them sort of matches is going to be important, because people, again, are going to see right through that. So I'm going to stop sharing. Happy to answer any questions, thoughts, comments, either now or going into the breakout here.
I can't access the Q&A, so is it okay to just ask the question here? Okay. Does the unemployment, does that include individuals who are self-employed, or is that excluded if you don't take a W-2?
So the unemployed are individuals who are filing for unemployment assistance. So you generally, that's difficult to do if you've been self-employed.
Mm-hmm.
That's nearly impossible. I mean, they changed it for COVID, but before COVID, that was essentially impossible. So
when you were talking about sort of unexplained, this number that the number of unemployed people is increasing, but who's in the labor force and where are they? My question would be, with the rise of like the gig economy, with people really moving much more towards entrepreneurship and taking that control of making money into their own hands, how does that get reflected in these statistics that we're looking at?
So that's one of the theories. That's one of the theories on that decline, is that the gig economy is sucking people out of it, and that could be part of it. However, the way that the labor force participation rate is asked is that it's in the American Community Survey. They don't ask you like, do you work under a W-2 contract? Like, they ask you, have you earned money in the past month, right? And if they answer yes, then there's other things, but almost everyone in the gig economy would answer yes to those series of questions. Now, some don't or wouldn't, right? Because another issue with the gig economy is that keeping track of them is very difficult, right? No one's tracking them almost on any of the platforms, and a lot of them aren't incentivized to be truthful, right? However, there is particularly for the driving gig economy platforms, we're seeing a massive rise in the past few years of those people not necessarily becoming like LLCs, but establishing themselves as employer entities, right? So they're becoming gig workers, not with their social security number per se, but with an employee identification number. So that's a relatively new phenomenon, which is why, again, this entire, like, some of the gig economy workers that left at the start of the gig economy, they're sort of a lot of them becoming more sophisticated and would get put back into it, right? Because now they're sort of counted as employers.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of questions here. Clint said Cedar Rapids is where Chambersburg gets promoted to. That's great. Well, good. I'm glad. Good. That answers that question. Clint also asked, please address disparity in wages by company size due to exaggerated compensation relative to average employee at the top level employees. So that is, yes, absolutely. When the average wage of large companies, particularly when you get to the 100 plus, a lot of that has to do with, you end up with a greater gradation, right? And since 1980, inflation adjusted, the median worker salary has stayed the same due to inflation. CEO pay has tripled. And so it is one of the reasons why those median numbers are so high. And those are averages, those aren't medians, right? So they are impacted by that. Is definitely the case. And so there are certainly a lot of folks in the bottom part that don't make a lot, but ostensibly, if you're able to, get the promotion rates are much higher in larger companies. And so, Clint, you're certainly right that does impact the difference in pay rates. But there is some opportunities there where ideally folks, even the lower levels of larger companies, aren't making that little for long. Kurt did ask, how do discouraged workers become aware of new opportunities as the economy picks up? Do they have skill sets necessary? Is there such thing as the chronically discouraged? Absolutely, there's such things as chronically discouraged. A lot of people are discouraged for a long time, and part of that has to do, how do we retrain them? I think I made some sort of crack about, if I was in the C6 side of the chamber house, that would have been my entire presentation. All right, talking about how do we retrain, reskill people. And the challenge with that is retraining and reskilling is something that employers do on small scale, right? So occasionally you'll see companies do apprentice programs or things like that to do it. Often they rely on education systems, and our education system just isn't really built for it anymore. There are fewer trade schools. High schools don't do as good of a job. Community colleges are probably going to be the next wave of where that works. And so I think it's going to be, I think developing a system where the 12 plus education system is able to better address the needs of the workforce, both now and next 5 years, which are going to be different, and 10 years, which are going to be different. Marvin asked, I think I'll answer these two very quickly because I have two left. Marvin asked the difference between diversity and inclusion. How does diversity and inclusion impact recruitment and retention? So diversity is you have different people there. Inclusion is that they're listened to. And so that's generally the best way to think about it. That impacts recruitment and retention because I want everyone to think about, regardless of your demographic background, I want you to think about maybe interviews you've had for jobs. And I want you to think about ones where you went in and the office community felt vibrant, and ones you went in where it did not. And that's something that a lot of people forget after sort of the hiring process. But there have definitely been times, I think it's true for nearly everybody, where you walk in and everyone's working together and pointing it over their shoulder at a computer, and maybe they're chatting or having a good time, whatever. And times you walk in and you hear a pin drop. And that is how it almost directly recruits recruitment and retention. I cited the LGBT statistic that 2 out of 5 have left a job because of bullying. There's similar statistics for other groups as well. Bernice asked, how do part-time workers fit into this? They fit in fine because part-time workers are counted in the employment count. So now they aren't double counted, right? So 62% of American adults are in the labor force. If you have 2 part-time jobs, you're not double counted. So you are in the labor force once. So that might address some of that. So, but it is 10 o'clock. I'm at time. So thank you.